Welcome back to the museum, everybody. Hi, I'm David Cowan, president of the museum, and our guest today is Haley Sweetland Edwards, and she is a correspondent at Time. Interestingly, recently she just covered policy issues at both the Republican and Democratic convention. And if that's not interesting enough, between 2009 and 2012, she lived abroad in Yemen and in the former Soviet Union, where she wrote blogs and articles for places like the New York Times, the LA Times, Atlantic, the New Republic. Now, before Time, she worked as an editor at the Washington Monthly, and before that as a resident reporter at the Seattle Times. Her undergraduate work is in philosophy and history at Yale, and then she went to Columbia to get her journalism degree. Now, we've all heard a lot about international governing bodies. There is the Olympic Committee, there's FIFA, there's the Hague Tribunal, but this book, and what she's going to talk about today, is about something that I certainly, when I read it, had no idea about. It's called the ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement, and it is the topic of her book. It is very interesting, as most things Haley does. My pleasure to introduce Haley Sweetland Edwards.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's lovely to be here. Is the microphone at the right level? It's actually, when we were talking just before this, and Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, has, everyone asked me, why would you choose to write a book about this topic? And the answer to that is basically I discovered that it existed and thought this can't possibly be right. There can't possibly be this entire court system that exists on an international level that I've never heard about, and I've certainly never read about. And I did an archive search of the New York Times. It had been mentioned once in, I think, 1999 or 2001, something like that. This is a tribunal system that has been around in international trade treaties since the 1950s, and that was the first time it had been mentioned in the New York Times. So when I stumbled on this, I thought either I'm misunderstanding what this thing is, or this is a totally underreported topic that desperately requires some attention. And then I started digging and realized it was the latter, and now you have a book that addresses at least some part of it. So one of the things I wanted to start with here, and I've given this speech a few times now, but since we're on Wall Street, I wanted to begin with the experience of investors. And going back just in the history of time, 2,000 years ago, investors abroad had basically no rights. If you wanted to leave your homeland with your goods on your goat cart, as soon as you left the area that the monopoly of power that your leader had on where you were on your own. If some warring tribe wanted to take all your things and send you home or kill you, you really didn't have a choice. That was it. It was a very, very, very risky business. That slowly changed over the millennia, and you saw there's these little inflection points over in the Middle Ages is a great example, where you started seeing these groups of merchants come together and form confederacies, where they would say, we're going to protect each other, and in exchange, if some kingdom doesn't treat us well, we together will boycott them. Or they would all pay in a little bit of money and come up with actual boats that would protect them in the North Sea. They were private armies, basically. And so that was 600, 700 years ago. And then beginning about 300 years ago, you saw the rise of nation states, and all this begins to change. The importance of global trade starts to rise. And you have the formation of these very informal tribunals. And they were almost always in the wake of wars. So you would have, two, and again, beginning early nation states. Hard to remember that what we have now wasn't the way it always was. But after wars, you would have these nation states come together, And they would say, not only are we going to sign this treaty, but we're actually going to look at what private property was destroyed over the course of this war. So one of my favorite examples is that no one knows about and certainly isn't taught in our 5th grade U.S. history classes. But in the wake of the Revolutionary War here in the U.S., representatives from England came over, representatives of the Founding Fathers, or their cohort sat down, and they said, okay, not only are we ending this war, but let's look at what property was destroyed. What merchant ships were destroyed during this process, whose farms were destroyed, and what's the obligation of the English to pay back a little bit to these private farmers, these private investors. So again, that began these tribunals, very informal. You're sitting down in a room, and these original documents are fascinating, because actually just people sitting down and saying, well, I think that guy's farm is worth about $200, and or the things that were destroyed, and so they would agree, they would hash out, oh well, I think it was more like 150, and then they would arrive at a conclusion. So that was 1780s about. Throughout the 1800s, these tribunals start cropping up more. Early 20th century, they crop up more and more. And then it wasn't till World War II, in the wake of World War II, that this idea that maybe we should have these tribunals that are informal and exist after disputes, maybe we should have those written into trade agreements or written into these bilateral investment treaties. And that is the kernel of how we got to this ISDS that we have now. And investor-state dispute settlement started out as a really good idea. And I think that's this kind of, that's the kernel of this thought, that everyone in this room probably can get behind the idea that if you are going to go start a factory in some other country, you want certain protections for that private property. And that is what happened in the 1950s. People got together in a room and they started putting in to these trade agreements provisions that said, if someone messes with your property when you're in a foreign country, you have a private avenue to fix that problem, basically. And that was, so that's basically the history. That's the last 2,000 years of how we got to where we are now. And then over the last 40 years, this was started getting written into trade agreements in the 1950s. Over the last 40 years, it was very rarely used. So to give you an example, the United Kingdom, the British there was a British company that had a factory in Sri Lanka. That factory was destroyed there was a military engagement and their factory was destroyed. They used this ISDS clause written into this investment treaty, and people came together in a room and they determined that factory was worth about $500,000. And so that's what was paid out. The Sri Lankan government paid this private investor $500,000 for destroying its property. And everyone, that was a pretty good idea. It was a non-issue. It really was. And this is what's so fascinating about this. And this is why this has not appeared in the New York Times or any other tribunal or any other publication for so many years, because it was a non-issue. It was, if someone's property got destroyed in a foreign country, they would form this tribunal, determine how much money they should be paid, and that was the end of it. There were the first 50 years about that ISDS was written into every trade agreement, every bilateral investment treaty. There were about 40 claims total that we know about. So, every other year or so, there would be a tribunal formed. So this is where it starts to get crazy. In the last 20 years, there have been 700 that we know about. So all of a sudden, beginning in the late 90s, it was just this explosion of new claims. And the question was, there's so many things about this, but the question is why? And one of the reasons why I wrote this book is I wanted to know why. And you see these graphs, it's just one claim every couple years, one claim every 5 years, and then all of a sudden just shoots through the roof. 700. What are we looking at? And there are a few answers to that question. One, probably a lot of people in this room are aware that global trade exploded in the 90s. But another is that suddenly our world just got much more litigious. And we started looking back on these paragraphs written into these trade agreements. And again, like looking at these primary documents is so fascinating because you think, okay, well, we're forming this global system of tribunals, this whole global court system. Surely this is going to be pages and pages of documents that say this is how this is going to work, and this is how this arbitrator gets appointed, and this is how this unfolds. None of that. It's literally like 3 paragraphs long. I've seen Facebook posts longer. And they're all based on, they all use this language that says, and this is a real sentence, foreign countries must provide fair and equitable treatment to all investors operating on their soil. Sounds reasonable, right? But what the heck does that actually mean? And this is why we've seen this explosion of cases, because all of a sudden it gets into a situation where you say, well, what does it mean to treat me fairly? Or what does it mean to treat my property fairly?